Plato is our great mind for this lecture, and it's hard to imagine a greater, especially in terms of his influence on the Western intellectual tradition. Plato is a 4th century Athenian philosopher and a student of Socrates, who is also the main character in Plato's writings, which we'll get to. Plato is the founding figure of Western philosophy. There are philosophers before Plato, but none of them leave us a literary legacy that becomes the basis for the rest of Western thought. And Plato's literary legacy, his writings, are really at the foundation of the whole tradition of Western philosophy. One modern philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, has said, Plato, or rather Western philosophy, is a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's almost not an exaggeration. What Plato founds is a form of philosophy we can call metaphysics. When we get to the postmodern philosophers at the end of this series of lectures, this tradition of metaphysics, which is at the heart of Western philosophy, will be raised as a fundamental problem as well as a fundamental resource of Western thought. Metaphysics is the notion that there's something like true being, not merely apparent being. True being that is somehow beneath or behind or within or above the apparent being, the appearances of this world. That's a deep notion, maybe a false notion, maybe a problematic notion, maybe a notion we can't escape even though we can't be happy with it. That's what the postmodernist philosophers will often think about as they think about Plato. You can't escape Plato. You can't escape Plato and still be a Western thinker. And yet, this notion of metaphysics, of a deep or high or true being, is a problematic notion. It's a notion that gets us thinking. It's not just an idea that sits there in the Western tradition. It's a source of disagreement, debate, trouble, and inspiration. So Plato founds what we can call metaphysics. The word metaphysics is Aristotle's word. It's very typical that Aristotle, who is a student of Plato, gives a name for what Plato has already been doing. So Plato was doing metaphysics before there was a name for it. He was on a quest for true being before Aristotle gave the name metaphysics to that quest. Now, when Plato was on this quest, he pursued the quest by writing philosophical dialogues. He would write, in essence, something like little plays in which we'd have characters discussing philosophical issues and having philosophical and critical discussions about those issues. And the main character in these little dramas or dialogues is Socrates, Plato's teacher. We need to say a little bit about the setting in 4th century Athens or actually 5th century for Socrates, for Socrates' work. When Plato was growing up in Athens and Socrates was at work, the educational system in Athens had been changing. There hadn't really been an educational system. If you were a young man, and it was only young men who needed education in those days, we're talking about a very sexist society. It's the young men who count. It's the young men who will rule. It's the young man whose education is at issue. Young men were educated by their fathers within the household, right? It's good enough for me, it's good enough for my son. I know what to do as a citizen of Athens, I can teach my son. That's the old aristocratic notion. But this was changing, because into Athens there was an influx now of new teachers called sophists. They were professional teachers, right? The first professional teachers that the Greek world knew about. They would teach for a fee, which meant, of course, that they claimed to have knowledge that was worth paying for, right? And they would go and get the young men, get them talking, and then try to persuade the fathers through the young men that they needed to pay for their education. The kind of education that they typically would give or offer would be an education in speaking. This is an ancient democracy in Athens, and imagine a democracy without TV, news, newspapers, anything like that, no media other than speech. So eloquence in speech is the fundamental form of media power in Athens. It's a fundamental form of political power. So the sophists would educate or offer for a fee the skill in speaking, which is a skill in political power, right? You want your son to be a big man in Athens? I'll teach him how. I'll teach him to be a powerful and virtuous and wise person. A wise person who can speak about anything in public and win the day, win the argument, win law cases, persuade the rest of the Athenians that they should go to war like you want them to, or not go to war like you want them to, or whatever, right? So wisdom for the sophists meant ability to speak eloquently, persuasively. They called themselves sophists because Sophia is Greek for wisdom, right? They were wise men. They taught wisdom for a fee. This may seem a ridiculous idea, teaching wisdom for a fee. So it seemed to Socrates, who was a native Athenian, not one of these foreigners coming in. The sophists were all non-Athenians. And Socrates had a different program for young men. He didn't claim to be wise. He didn't claim to know all the answers. He certainly didn't collect a fee. Right? He walked around with young men, and he asked more fundamental questions than the sophists would ask. The sophists would teach you how to talk about virtue and vice, which is the opposite of virtue, and good and evil, and what should you do, what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. The sophists would teach you how to talk about those things. But Socrates thought, before you talk about these things, you ought to know what they are. What is virtue, after all? So Socrates would typically ask these questions, what is virtue? Or he'd take a particular virtue, like justice, and ask, what is justice? What is temperance? What is courage? What is piety? Let's try to find out. I don't know what it is. Now, young man, do you know what it is? Maybe you do. Why don't I ask this question? Why don't you tell me what you think the answer is? Or, more comically, Socrates would ask somebody who thought they knew the answers already. Maybe a sophist, maybe one of the elder statesmen of Athens. And imagine Socrates coming up to a big man in Athens, a powerful person who's moved a lot of people by their speeches. Someone like Pericles, maybe. This would be a little bit chronologically out of order, but imagine someone like Pericles and someone like Socrates, and Socrates says, okay, Pericles, you've been persuading us what the right thing is to do. Tell me what justice really is. And then, after Pericles gives an answer, Socrates would then ask a critical question. Well, if that's the answer, then my next question is da-da-da-da-da. And the dialogue would go on like that until finally Socrates has asked more and more probing and critical questions, and the conclusion of the dialogue is, in Plato's early dialogues, that the big man doesn't know the answer. He can't really give a clear account of what something like virtue or justice is. So the early Socratic dialogues of Plato, these early literary productions, which are in the form of a drama, where Socrates is the main character, end in perplexity, in the recognition of ignorance. This is what has been called the Socratic wisdom, the wisdom of recognizing that you're not wise, the wisdom of not being a sophist. Right? And the method of question and answer has been called the Socratic method. Right? It's a method where a teacher does not just lecture and tell you what's what. A teacher asks you questions, you reply, the teacher asks more critical questions, and you discover that you don't know what you thought you knew. Right? At least that's where things end in the early Socratic dialogues of Plato. This may have been the way that Socrates himself actually did things. At least most people think so. Now the question is the message of Socrates simply the message of skepticism? Right? We don't know the answer. We don't know what virtue is. We don't know any of these things. Right? At the end of these Socratic dialogues, we recognize that we don't know. Is that the final answer? We just don't know what virtue is. Well, Plato, in his middle dialogues, they're called, his later literary productions, came up with the notion that, no, we can give an answer to the question, what is virtue? We can give an answer to a question like, what is justice? It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of Socratic question and answer. We still have to use the Socratic method. Plato called this dialectic, which is from a word meaning dialogue. But we can actually get an answer. We can find the answer to a question like, what is virtue? And that's when metaphysics is born. That's when the notion of a true being of things enters the Western tradition big time. It has predecessors in Parmenides and so on. But for most of the Western tradition, the key notion here is that you can give a fundamental right answer to a question like, what is virtue? You can find the true being of virtue. You can find its form, Plato will say. And this is the famous Platonic doctrine of forms, or you might have heard the doctrine of Platonic ideas. I'm going to use the word form for a reason I'll let you know about in a minute. Call them forms. Virtue itself is a form. The true being of virtue is a form. What we're asking for when we ask what is virtue is a form. We're asking for an unchanging essence of virtue. Contrast that with, say, the many different ways of being virtuous. Right? There's more than one way of being virtuous. There's more than one virtue. And virtue in Athens might be different than virtue in Sparta, which might be different than virtue in the United States in the 20th century or the 21st century. So there's a lot of virtues, and there's changes in what counts for virtue. But Plato wants to know the true being of virtue, virtue itself, the essence of virtue, the unchanging being of virtue. And in wanting that, Plato is inventing Western metaphysics. He wants the true being of virtue. He also wants, well, the true being of virtue has to have two features. First of all, it's one thing, not many. There's many, many different virtuous acts. There's many kinds of virtues, but there's only one form or essence of virtue. Right? He wants that one thing which governs or gives form to or gives identity and nature to the many acts of virtue. So the one form of virtue forms all the many. Right? The one forms the many. And this one-many relationship is crucial for Plato and for the Platonist tradition. It's one form. And secondly, it's an unchanging form. Right? The form of virtue doesn't change. Virtue is really fundamentally the same thing now as it was back in Plato's time. Some aspects of virtue in history have changed. Right? What makes a good American is different than what makes a good Athenian. But virtue itself has not changed. Virtue itself is eternal. Right? So there you have this notion of a deep or high or fundamental true being which is unchanging and eternal, deeper than the changes of the historical world and more true than the appearances of history and culture and all those things. Plato will call this form. I'm using the word essence. That's a good name for it. And also Plato uses the word idea, which doesn't mean the same thing that idea now means. Nowadays, when we talk about an idea, we talk about something in our heads, right? For Plato, idea is not something in your heads. An idea is something you see. It's literally Greek for what you see. But he means something you see with your mind's eye, not the eye of your body. The form of virtue is something you will never see with your physical eyes, but it's something you can see, as it were, with your mind. So that's why he calls it idea. It's an unchanging essence which is, well, not located in the physical world. It's not located in your mind. It's located metaphorically above us in an unchanging world, and we'll get to that. But at any rate, when we talk about the Platonic ideas, we're not talking about ideas in our mind, right? And so in order to avoid being confusing about that, I'll call them Platonic forms, which is another word that Plato used. So, in summary, Platonic ideas or forms are true being, the unchanging essence or form of things in this world, especially the form of ethical virtues. We see these things with our mind's eye, not our body's eye. Let me suggest an analogy which will make this a little bit easier to follow. Think about mathematics. Now, I know mathematics is a lot different from virtue, but for Plato, they have something in common. In fact, what Plato is doing, I think, is in some sense comparing ethical thought about virtue and justice and those things to mathematical thought about, say, triangles or addition. Let's suppose we have a triangle. Let's suppose we're in a math class, right? Think about a triangle. Think about a math professor drawing a triangle on a chalkboard, right? Now, the math professor is going to go on and prove some theorems about this chalk triangle, the Pythagorean theorem, for instance. But wait a minute. I just misspoke, didn't I? Because the math professor is not really going to be proving a theorem about the chalk triangle, right? Because, you know, if you tried measuring a chalk triangle, it would come out to something like 180 degrees, but probably not exactly, right? Because the lines are not perfectly straight, the angles aren't perfect. Because the chalk triangle, in a sense, is not a real triangle. Now, what have we just said? What is a real triangle, then? The real triangle that we're learning about in a math class is not something you can see with the eye of your body, right? You will never, ever see the real triangle of which the Pythagorean theorem is true. You will never, ever see the triangle that you're learning all those theorems about in math class. except you will see it with your mind's eye, right? As if, well, what happens when you're in math class and you're struggling to understand, and then suddenly it comes to you, aha, I see it, I get it, I see it. That kind of seeing is the kind of seeing that means that you really know what the math teacher has to teach. That kind of seeing also, Plato thinks, is the kind of seeing in which we see the form of virtue and justice. It's a seeing with the mind's eye, seeing something that you will never ever see with your body's eye. So that means, you see, that if you're a Platonist, you have to get used to the idea that the things you see with your own eyes are not the real things. They're not exactly illusions, but they're not as real as the real triangle, right? The chalk triangle is really there. It's real in some sense, but it's not the real triangle. And what we want to know about is the real triangle, this thing that you can only understand with your mind's eye, right? So here again is metaphysics, right? Metaphysics means we're looking at something that's deeper than what you see on the surface, deeper than anything you can see with your eyes, deeper and truer than the world of appearance. Plato will have, well, he has a whole set of vocabulary for making this distinction between the true being of things, the nature of the forms, and these sensible things, he'll call them. Let's run through that vocabulary quickly. The true triangle, which you can really know and see with your mind's eye, is something we have knowledge of. That's what the kind of knowledge you get in a math class. The kind of knowledge you get of things you can see is mere opinion. Imagine that you tried to figure out the Pythagorean theorem by actually measuring triangles that were drawn with chalk or pencil, right? You'd get an approximation of the Pythagorean theorem, which Plato would call opinion, not knowledge. Knowledge is when you really understand that theorem and you say, aha, I see it, right? It's absolutely clear, it's crystal clear, you can't be mistaken about it, you really know that, right? That's real knowledge. Whereas the sort of knowledge you get by experience is not really knowledge, it's just opinion. It's the sort of thing you'd get by measuring a bunch of pencil or chalk triangles. Another feature is that the chalk triangle is an imitation or an image or a reflection or a shadow of the real triangle. That's a set of metaphors that Plato loves to use to describe the relationship between true being and appearance. The world of being, he will call it, as opposed to the world of becoming. That's another piece of vocabulary I'll get to in a second. But think of that difference. The chalk triangle is, as it were, imitating the real triangle. It's an image of, or a reflection of, or a shadow of the real triangle. Get used to the idea that what you see and touch and taste and feel is only a shadow of the real thing, which you see with your mind's eye. The real thing is unchanging, and therefore it belongs to being, capital B, as opposed to becoming, the world of change. Right? The true triangle belongs to being rather than becoming. It's also, here's a key piece of terminology, it's intelligible as opposed to sensible. The word sensible for Plato comes from the word senses, right? And it means anything you can perceive with your five senses, anything that's visible to the eye, anything that's audible to the ear, tangible to the touch, anything you can smell or taste. Those things are things in the world of becoming, the world of opinion, the world of shadows. Whereas the thing that you really understand with your mind's eye is intelligible. That comes from the word intellect, or intelligence, which is actually a Greek word meaning to understand. Right? So the intelligible thing is the thing that you understand. Plato will compare it to visibility. Right? He'll talk about seeing with the mind's eye, right? Visible to the mind's eye, but that's a metaphor clearly, right? You don't see the triangle, the true triangle, with your body's eye. So once you get this language down, you begin to get the hang of Plato's talk about true being and why it's so very, very different from what you see or taste or touch. I mean, the thing that we call the real world, right? I bang on the podium, right? That's real, right? Sure as I'm sitting here and I can sit on a chair, right? But for Plato, that's not the ultimate reality. Why would you think that something you can bang into is ultimate reality? Plato wants to know about ultimate reality. And so it takes a little getting used to think about this ultimate reality, which is more real than what we normally call the real world. So let me suggest an allegory, a symbolic story that comes from Plato himself, which will help you get the hang of this metaphysics of a true being that goes beyond the world of appearances. This is an allegory or parable of the cave, it's called. It comes from Plato's Republic, which we'll be hearing about later. It's the great lecture on the great book on Plato's politics. But in the middle of it is this allegory about metaphysics, about true being. So this is an allegory, a symbolical story. Let me tell the literal version of the story first, and then we'll unpack it in its philosophical meaning. Start by imagining yourself in a dark cave. You're not only in a dark cave, though. You're tied up. You're chained. You're chained so that your head cannot turn. You're looking straight ahead of you at a wall. And what you're seeing is shadows on the wall. The shadows are cast by a fire that's behind you. You can't turn around and look at the fire. You can't even turn around and look at the things that are casting the shadows. And what's casting the shadows is, well, it doesn't matter too much what, but let's suppose cardboard cutouts of things. A cardboard cutout of a triangle, for instance. Or the cardboard cutout of a tree. Right? Because even trees are not real things. The trees that we see with our eyes are not real things. They're only shadows of the real things. And then there's another cardboard cutout we could call virtue. Right? So imagine 3 cardboard cutouts. One is a triangle, one is a tree, one is virtue. And you're looking at the shadows of them on the wall. Right? Now that's a strange picture, Plato says, but it's us. It's where we are right now. Right? You're looking at, I don't know, a videotape or a table or a chair. Those are all shadows, right? What would it be like if you could look away from them at something real? Well, that's hard to imagine when you spend all your life chained up, looking straight ahead at the shadows, and you think that those shadows are the only real thing. And like so many other people, you say, that's the real world. That's the practical world. That's the world of what matters. That's the world of money, for instance, right? And for many of us, that's the real world. Well, for Plato, it's not. But you can't see that until something changes in your life. What has to change, metaphorically, is you have to first be liberated, unchained, so you can turn around. That's the second thing. You get unchained or liberated, right? And the image of freedom and liberation is crucial here. You also turn around. And the word for turning is the word that gets translated into Latin as conversio, from which we get our word conversion. Right? This is a conversion experience, a world of turning away from the darkness to the light. Right? And then the third thing you have to do is climb. You have to get up out of the cave. The cave is underground. And you ascend. And this is an image of the ascent of the soul from a world of appearance and illusion to a world of true being. So you get liberated, you get conversion, and you ascend. You climb up. And you get out into the light. Forget about the fire for a minute. The fire's not so important. You get out into the real light, the light of day, the light of the sun. This is what Plato will call the intelligible world, the world of true being. We could call it the other world, right? As in otherworldliness. Right? Because Plato's telling us about a level of being that many of us never realized existed. Many of us still think that the cave is the real world. Well, here's this other world, this world of eternal being, of truth that never changes. Everything down in the cave changes. Virtue, triangles. The triangles in the cave change because you can erase them, you can change them, right? But the true triangle that you learn about in a math class, that doesn't change. So you're getting up out of the world of change and death and into the world of eternity and true being. And the first thing that happens, of course, is you're blinded. You can't see because it's too bright up there, right? After all, learning true being is hard, right? The mind gets dazzled just like your eyes would get dazzled coming into the light, the sunlight, for the very first time in your life. You get dazzled. You can't take it. You can't see. But you practice, right? You learn. You get educated. And you eventually become able to see these true forms, right? To understand them. And maybe you'll start off by looking at the reflections and shadows, but eventually you'll be able to see a real tree, right? Not a cardboard cutout, not a shadow, not a reflection, but the real thing. Just look right at it and see what the essence, the form, the true being of a tree is. Or the essence, form, true being of a triangle. Or, and this is the most important thing, the essence, form, or true being of virtue. of justice, of the good. In fact, the good is the last thing you see, because the good is the sun itself, the shining light which gives light to everything else. The first principle, the supreme being, Plato calls it the good. In religious terms, you could call it the supreme good. And indeed, Christian theologians would come along later and say, the supreme good, that's God, right? The source of being, just as the sun is what makes possible the life of plants and animals on earth, right? It gives being to these things, but also intelligibility. It makes it possible for us to see them, right? There's a kind of light of the mind which makes it possible for us to see. So that's what happens in education. That's what happens as we learn to turn away from mere appearances, as if the chalk triangle was a real triangle, right? Maybe as you're beginning in a math class, you sort of think the chalk triangle is what the math class is all about. But later you learn better, right? As you get more and more educated, you realize the chalk triangle is just an imitation or a symbol almost of the real thing. So you get to see those real things. You get to be good at seeing them, right? That's what education is about. Then something else happens. You can't stay up there. Not until you die. We'll get to that next lecture. You can't stay up there in the other world where all is light and unchanging truth. You eventually have to go back down to the cave. And in fact, if you follow Plato's advice, what you'll do is you'll educate a bunch of young men by teaching them what true virtue is. Actually, they have to see it for themselves, right? This is clear. You can't just be told what true virtue is. You have to climb up yourself, right? With the help of a teacher, who maybe someone like Socrates, who asks you questions, what is true virtue? And you find the answer for yourself. You see it for yourself. Like listening to a math professor who, you can't just sort of memorize the theorem and understand it. You have to understand it for yourself. See it with your own mind's eye, right? So the teacher helps you get started thinking about it, but you don't just sort of memorize what the teacher says. You see it for yourself. And then, if you're following Plato's program of education, you get dragged back down into the cave and made to be king. That's the idea. Because Plato wants people ruling in the Republic who know what the good is, who know what true justice is, who know what true virtue is. You have to know some metaphysics in order to be a good ruler, Plato thinks. Because you have to know what virtue and justice and goodness truly are. That's why Plato has this program of education in the center of his treatise on politics in the Republic. And the center of it, of that treatment of education, is the vision of the true being of the forms. So you come back down into the cave. First thing that happens is, once again, your eyes have to adjust, right? You've been getting used to seeing things in the bright light of day. You get back down in the cave, and your eyes are darkened. You can't see anything. You stumble around. You act like a philosopher, right? The kind of people who fall down into wells because they're contemplating the sky. That was the first philosopher, Thales. Famous joke about him. Looking at the heavens, he fell down a well. Philosophers are like that. They're people who've seen the light and now have to adjust to the darkness of what we call the real world. They're not good at making money. Socrates wasn't, right? They're not good at playing political power games. Socrates wasn't. They don't teach the sort of things that sophists teach, right? Sophists are good at political power games. Socrates is not. But the kind of person you want to really rule the city is not the sophists, not the people who believe in political power games, not the political consultants and the people who listen to political consultants. You don't want them. You want the people who've seen what the true good really is. You want people like Socrates, right? Now, Socrates avoided political office, but Plato is thinking, if you have someone like a Socrates in your midst, what you do with him is you make him king. You say, you have to rule over us because you understand more about this than we do. Even if you don't think you know what true virtue is, at least you're asking the question. And Plato thinks that, in fact, you can ask this question and you can guide young people to begin to get the answer, to actually see what true virtue is, and thus, once they've seen it, you drag them back down into the cave, you make them rule over you. You make philosophers into kings. That's the key idea of Plato's political theory. So not only is Plato inventing this new form of philosophy called metaphysics, he's saying it's the real basis of human life, if it's going to be well-ordered human life. It's the basis of ethics, it's the basis of politics. The person you want to have power is the one who actually understands what the true good really is. True being, knowledge of true being, is what's really practical, if what we want is a good life, a life in the city or the republic that is worth living. So you want to make philosophers kings. But we'll hear about that in a later lecture.